First Harvest Ministries International, the Apostolic Assembly of the House of Israel. From the desk of the founder and apostolic overseer, the tax that changed the world. How Rome taxed Jewish identity and Christianity learned to run from it. A letter from Reverend John Shane Vaughn, founder and apostolic overseer, First Harvest Ministries International. Beloved of the House of Israel, this month I want to settle a mystery that has troubled honest believers for centuries. Read it slowly. It will shock you, and then it will make everything make sense. How did Christianity make such a departure from its own Jewish roots? Long before the Catholic Church formalized the divorce and spent centuries severing whatever ties remained, something happened. Something earlier, something quieter, and it has puzzled honest believers for generations, because on the surface, it makes no sense at all. Think about it with me. The faith began entirely Jewish. A Hebrew Messiah, Hebrew apostles, Hebrew scriptures. A movement that lived inside the synagogue, kept the Sabbath, honored the feasts, and worshipped the Elohim of Israel. And then, seemingly all at once, the faith did not merely drift away from its identity. It recoiled from it. It did not want it. It grew embarrassed by it, then suspicious of it, and at last openly hostile to it. How? How does a faith come to despise the very identity of its own founder? How does a movement of Sabbath-keeping, feast-honoring, Torah-reading followers of a Jewish Messiah turn around within a few generations and declare that it must have nothing in common with the Jews? It is one of the strangest reversals in all of religious history, and the honest believer feels the oddness of it. It is too sudden, it is too complete, and something had to drive it. The answer will shock you, and once you see it, the whole strange story will finally make sense. Because the thing that first pried Christianity loose from its Hebrew roots was not a theologian. It was not a heresy. It was not even a church council. It was a tax. Now, you may think a tax is too small a thing to reshape a world religion. So before I show you the tax, let me remind you of what a tax can do. Most Americans know about the tea tax. We were taught it in school. A tax on tea helped spark a revolution. Crates were dumped into Boston Harbor. Ordinary men, farmers, shopkeepers, fathers, took up arms against the most powerful empire on earth. And it is worth asking the question plainly, why? The tea was not that expensive. The tax was not that large. So what turned reasonable, peaceable people into revolutionaries? It was never really about the price of tea. It was what the tax meant. About domination, about being told who you were and what you owed without your consent. The tax became a symbol of an empire's hand pressing down on a people's identity. And once a tax becomes a symbol, the amount stops mattering. Men will do extraordinary things and pay extraordinary prices to escape what a tax represents. Now hold that thought, because there was another tax long before Boston Harbor. One history has nearly forgotten, and it may have changed the world even more than the tea ever did. It was not placed on tea. It was placed on Jews. And that tax helped drive one of the greatest religious identity shifts in human history. The slow, sad separation of the faith of Yeshua from its own Hebrew roots. This is the story of Fiscus Judaicus, a Jewish tax imposed by Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem, and it answers the question we came here to settle. A word before we begin. Hear me clearly, because I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. This was not one tax acting alone in a single afternoon. It was a chain, and every link of that chain is going to be in your hands before this letter is over. The Fiscus Judaicus was the ignition point, the spark, and once it was struck, the fire was fed by Roman persecution, by the catastrophe of Bar Kokhba, by Gentile insecurity, by imperial politics, and finally by the church councils that took a frightened reflex and crowned it as doctrine. Financial pressure produced identity distancing. Identity distancing produced theological justification, and theological justification hardened into the anti-Jewish Christianity we inherited. That is the story. It is documented, it is indefensible, and I'm going to walk you through it link by link. 1. The original faith did not look Roman. The first believers in Yeshua did not gather around a Roman altar. They did not follow a Roman calendar. They did not worship a Roman Messiah. They did not eat at a Roman table. They followed Yeshua of Nazareth, a Hebrew Messiah from the house of David, who taught from the Torah, who kept the Sabbath, who went up to Jerusalem for the feasts, who worshipped the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and who told his disciples plainly that he did not come to destroy the law or the prophets. The apostles were Jews. The first congregation met in Jerusalem. The earliest believers lived inside the world of synagogue, scripture, Sabbath, and Israel's hope. Even the secular historians admit it. The earliest form of this faith was understood by everyone, including Rome, as a movement within Judaism. Why would anyone ever think they should not? That is the mystery. And to solve it, we have to walk into the room where history happened. 2. Rome destroyed the temple, then kept collecting the tax. In the year 70, Rome destroyed Jerusalem and burned the temple to the ground. Before that destruction, every Jewish man paid a half shekel tax, the 2 drachma tax, to support the temple service in Jerusalem. It was an act of worship. It funded the house of Yahweh. But after Rome leveled the temple, Rome did something cruel and calculated. Rome kept the tax alive. Only now, the money no longer went to the temple of Yahweh, because there was no temple. The money went to Rome. And worse, far worse, it was redirected to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the chief pagan god of the Roman Empire. Stop and hear what that means. Rome took the offering once associated with the worship of the living Elohim of Israel and rerouted it to fund the worship of a pagan idol. That is the Fiscus Judaicus. Rome was saying, in effect, you lost, your temple is rubble, your city is crushed, but you will still pay, and now your money will honor the gods of Rome. That was not merely a tax. That was humiliation with a government seal on it. And just like the tea in Boston Harbor, the amount was never the point. The meaning was the point. 3. The tax forced a dangerous question. Who counts as a Jew? At first glance, the tax sounds simple. Jews pay the Jewish tax. Done. But it was not simple at all. Because the moment Rome decided to tax the Jews, Rome had to answer a question that had never carried legal weight before. Who exactly counts as a Jew? Is it someone born of Jewish blood? Someone circumcised? Someone who keeps the Sabbath? Someone who attends synagogue? Someone who refuses pork? Someone who reads the Torah? Someone who worships the Elohim of Israel? Now bring the early believers into that room. Many were ethnically Jewish. Others were Gentiles grafted into Israel's Messiah. They read Israel's scriptures. They worshipped Israel's Elohim. They honored Israel's Messiah. And a great many of them still lived in ways that Rome would call Jewish. The more Jewish a believer appeared, the more exposed he became. And here is the line I want you to carry out of this teaching. The Fiscus Judaicus turned obedience into evidence. Sabbath was no longer just a commandment, it was evidence. Feasts were no longer just holy convocations, they were evidence. Clean eating, circumcision, synagogue fellowship, all of it became evidence in the eyes of an empire. And once obedience becomes evidence that can be used against you, compromise becomes very, very tempting. 4. The empire pressed harder. Some will say, surely the tax was a minor thing. Let me close that door. Under the emperor Domitian, enforcement became vicious. Rome went after people who lived as Jews without openly admitting it. The Roman historian Suetonius, a hostile witness, not one of ours, records that he personally watched a 90-year-old man stripped and physically examined in open court to determine whether he was circumcised, all to settle whether he owed the Jewish tax. A 90-year-old man stripped in court over a tax. That is a society where your body, your diet, your day of rest, and your worship could be dragged into a Roman court as proof of who you were. And when Nerva reformed the tax, he minted a coin celebrating the removal of the calumny attached to it. The very existence of that coin tells us this was politically explosive, not a side detail, but the economic engine that made living as a Jew dangerous. 5. The temptation. Prove you are not a Jew. Stand in their sandals for a moment. A Roman official looks at a believer and asks, "Do you live as a Jew? Then why do you keep the Jewish Sabbath? Why do you observe Jewish feasts? Why do you refuse to eat as a Roman eats? Why do you follow a Jewish Messiah?" Somewhere in that pressure, some believers discovered the path of least resistance. Stop looking Jewish. Stop sounding Jewish. Stop keeping the Sabbath. Stop observing the feasts. Make yourself unrecognizable as a Jew. And the taxman, the accuser, and the magistrate would pass you by. Now hear me carefully, because I will not slander the dead. I am not saying every believer who let go of the Sabbath did it out of cowardice or greed. Many were confused. Many were terrified. Many had families to feed. Many simply inherited the way of life that earlier men had already abandoned. But survival decisions have consequences. When one generation compromises under pressure, the next generation calls that compromise tradition. And when enough generations pass, tradition begins to preach as though it were scripture. 6. Bar Kokhba widened the wound. The tax was the spark, but the fire spread. In the year 132, Simon Bar Kokhba led a Jewish revolt against Rome. Many hailed him as a messianic deliverer, but the believers in Yeshua could not confess Bar Kokhba as Messiah. They already had their Messiah. To Rome, they still looked Jewish. To Bar Kokhba's followers, they were traitors, caught between two fires. Then Rome crushed the revolt, and by 135, the aftermath was devastation. Jews were slaughtered, enslaved, and scattered. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina as a deliberate insult to erase the name of Judah from the map. Circumcision was outlawed, and Jews were barred from Jerusalem itself. When the Jews were banished, the Hebrew believers in Yeshua were swept out with them. The historian Eusebius tells us that from that point on, the bishop of Jerusalem was a Gentile, because no Jew was permitted to live there. The center of gravity moved. Less Jerusalem, more Rome. Less Hebrew, more Greek. Less Sabbath, more Sunday. Less Torah, more church tradition. 7. The compromise became theology. This is where the story turns from sad to tragic. At first, the distancing was practical, survival. But later, it became theological. The believers did not merely say, "We are not Jews for tax purposes." They began to say, "The Jews are rejected." They began to say, "We must have nothing in common with the Jews." They began to say, "Sabbath keeping is Judaizing, and Judaizing is a sin." That, beloved, is the birth of anti-Jewish Christianity. It did not come from Yeshua. It did not come from the apostles. It did not come from the Torah. By the time of Constantine, the language was no longer subtle. After the Council of Nicaea, the emperor wanted one empire, one church, one calendar, and he wrote words that ought to make every honest believer tremble, declaring it unworthy to have anything in common with the Jews, and calling for separation from what he branded their detestable company. Once a church declares it must have nothing in common with the Jews, what then happens to the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish apostles, the Jewish scriptures, the Sabbath, the feasts, the covenants? They all get reinterpreted, spiritualized, renamed, transferred away. First you replace the calendar, then the commandments, then Israel, then the kingdom. And finally, you are left with a Messiah remade into a shape acceptable to Rome. 8. Laodicea, when the break became law. Eventually, the church did not merely prefer Sunday, it condemned the Sabbath. The Council of Laodicea declared that believers must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, that they should work on that day and honor the Lord's day instead. The fourth commandment says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." And a church council answered, "Do not rest on the Sabbath." That is not apostolic authority. That is institutional rebellion wearing religious robes. The reason was nakedly clear. The Sabbath looked Jewish. Therefore, the Sabbath had to be rejected. Not because Yeshua abolished it, he kept it. Not because the apostles overturned it, they kept it. But because 3 centuries of pressure had trained the church to fear anything that looked Hebrew. When a sincere believer today says, the Sabbath is a Jewish thing, he does not know he is repeating the voice of Romanized Christianity. 9. The new covenant did not erase the law, it relocated it. Hear the promise as Yahweh gave it through Jeremiah. The new covenant is not the abolition of his law. It is the internalizing of his law. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts. Jeremiah 31 and verse 33. The old covenant wrote the commandments on tablets of stone and set them before the people. The new covenant writes those same commandments on tablets of flesh and sets them within the people. The law did not die. The location changed from stone to heart, from outside to inside. So when men tell you the new covenant freed you from the law, they have it exactly backwards. It frees you to keep it, not in fear, not for attacks, but because the Spirit of Yahweh has written it on the inside of a new creature. 10. So why keep the tithe but reject the Sabbath? Now, at last, we can answer the question that started all of this. A dear sister named Michelle asked it plainly. Why do churches say we don't have to keep the law, the feasts, or the Sabbath because that's old covenant, but somehow the tithe is still mandatory? Part of the answer is tradition. Part is inconsistency. And yes, part is money. But the deep answer is history. The Sabbath looked Jewish, so it was pushed away. The feasts looked Jewish, so they were pushed away. Clean eating, Torah study, pushed away. But the tithe? No magistrate ever stripped a man to check whether he tithed. The tithe endangered no one, and it funded the institution, so the tithe survived. The church did not reject the Old Testament evenly. It rejected the parts that made it look Jewish. That is why a pulpit can thunder out of Malachi to collect the offering while it dismisses Leviticus when the holy days are mentioned. That is not biblical consistency. That is historical inheritance. The long shadow of a Roman tax still falling across the modern offering plate. 11. The people are not the enemy, the system is. Let me be firm but fair, because the Father is fair. Most believers today are not intentionally anti-Jewish. They did not invent this system. They were born into it. Told the Sabbath was bondage, the feast. They were born into it, told the Sabbath was bondage, the feasts were done away, the Torah was legalism, and Jewish simply meant obsolete. So we do not attack sincere people. We have compassion on them. The same compassion we will want when we stand before the Father. But while we have compassion on the people, we expose the system. The Sabbath is not merely Jewish. It is creation, set in place before there was ever a Jew. The feasts are not merely Jewish. They are Yahweh's appointed times. The Torah is not merely Jewish, it is instruction. And the new covenant is not lawlessness, it is the law written within. 12. The tax changed the world, but truth can change it again. The tea tax changed America. A small tax became the symbol of an empire's grip. The people threw off that grip and remade the world. But the Jewish tax may have changed something even greater. It helped reshape the very faith of Yeshua. The Fiscus Judaicus pressed an entire generation to answer one dangerous question: are you a Jew? And under the weight of Rome, far too many learned to say, no, we are not them. That answer became a wall. The wall became a doctrine, and the doctrine became a weapon, turned at last against the very roots of the faith it claimed to defend. Christianity did not become anti-Jewish because Yeshua was anti-Jewish. It became anti-Jewish when it became afraid of looking like the faith Yeshua actually lived. The restoration of all things calls us back to the room where it happened, back to the questions that matter. What did Yeshua actually teach? What did the apostles actually practice? What did the new covenant actually promise? And who was it really that first told us obedience to Yahweh was bondage? Because maybe the problem was never the Sabbath. Maybe the problem was Rome. Maybe the problem was never the feasts. Maybe the problem was fear. Maybe the problem was never the Torah. Maybe the problem was a church that made its peace with an empire and then called that peace freedom. The tax that changed the world. The truth can change it back.